go. My guest this morning is Louis L. Picone. Louis L. Picone is the best-selling and award-winning author of Grant's Tomb, The Epic Death of Ulysses S. Grant and the Making of an American Pantheon. The President is Dead, The Extraordinary Stories of Presidential Deaths, Final Days, Burials, and Beyond, and Where the Presidents Were Born, The History and Preservation of the Presidential Birthplaces. Louis is a member of the Ulysses S. Grant Monument Association, White House Historical Association, the American Historical Association, and is also a trustee on the board of the Grover Cleveland Birthplace Memorial Association in Caldwell, New Jersey. He holds a master's in history and also teaches at William Paterson University. Louis has spoken widely on the topic of the presidents and the places we commemorate them, including General Grant National Memorial, James A. Garfield National Historic Site, and the International Conference, U.S. Presidents and Russian Rulers at the Russian Academy of Sciences in Moscow. He has been featured on C-SPAN, Time Magazine, BBC News, NPR, Washington Post, New York Times, and the Travel Channel. Louis was also featured on the television program American Mystery on the Travel Channel to discuss the mystery of JFK's missing brain. If you want to learn more about Mr. Picone, visit his website, www.louispicone.com. That's www.louispicone.com. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Reading Circle microphones, Louis L. Picone. Louis, good morning.
Good morning, Mark.
Good to have you here in the studio. Now, folks, you know, if I have my guests on the phone, I generally do not fool around with or try to attempt call-ins because I don't want anybody to get dropped or to get lost. However, when I do have a guest live in the studio with me, like Louis is right now, I do entertain calls. So if you have a question, if you hear something Louis says, or if you just want to say hey to Louis or say hi, the number is 973-720-2738, and we'll get you on the air. We'll get your question on the air. All right, so Louis and I don't know if you all remember a few months back, if you remember, I had a guest on. His name was Paul Semendinger, and Paul was on because he authored the book about Roy White. And Roy White was one of my childhood baseball childhood baseball heroes, as I am a lifelong fan, or at least since 12 years old, from the Yankees. So I immediately invited Paul on when we met, and as Paul was here, he told me about Louis. And that particular day, I went to the Passaic County Book Festival, and I had a chance to meet Louis. And as always, we got our date scheduled, and it has come very quickly because that festival was back in what? Was back in June or May?
It was in June.
It was in June. All right, so June, and now we're already back here in September again. That's just how quickly time flies. So welcome. My first question, I usually actually we were talking in the lobby about questioning. My first question is kind of like, where did all this begin? Because Louis is a history buff, and history is. I think history is extremely important. But everybody, a lot of people think history, and especially kids, they get in there, that's the last subject they want to take is social studies and history and so on. And however, that's one of the most important subjects is knowing your history, understanding where things are, where they came from, how things happen, so forth and so on. So for you, especially since a lot of kids really don't care for history or social studies and all that, where did it start for you? How did it become an interest for you?
So I'd like to say that I've always been interested in history, and it started at a very early age, but that's really not the case for me. Sometimes I wonder how I got here, and I feel like a guy that's just been wandering the streets, daydreaming, and then looking up and wondering, like, how did I get here? For me, I look back and try to figure out how I became so interested in the presidents, and for me, it started about 15 years ago, and it started when I started to have children, and I used to do road trips with my kids, and we'd pack up the minivan, and I'd ask my parents to come, and we'd do road trips, and on one of these road trips, I wanted to bring my sons up on good music, so there was a Beatles festival in Louisville, Kentucky. So we drove out to Louisville, and I was looking on the map to see where can we go on the way. As we were driving, which sites we can stop at. And my parents would always take me and my brothers and my sister on road trips, and they'd always fit in historic sites too. Like when we drove to Disney World, we'd stop at Gettysburg and we'd stop at Williamsburg. So they kind of planted the seed for me. So when I was doing these road trips, I figured, what places can I see? And I've always been into national park sites as well. So on that road trip to Kentucky, we were driving through Ohio, and I was looking on the map to see what we can see on the way, and I noticed that there was 7 presidents born in Ohio. So I figured these were my trips. I was flipping the bill, so I can make the itinerary. And I decided that would be fun to go see all 7 presidential birthplaces while in Ohio. And on that trip, I did some research. I wanted to know what I was seeing in advance, and I found that there was inconsistent information on presidential birthplaces. Some of them had a lot of information, national park sites, like William Howard Taft's birthplace. Others had almost no information, like Benjamin Harrison's birthplace was just a sign on a neighborhood street that Benjamin Harrison was born here. So the idea started to get planted. This would be pretty interesting to go see all of the presidential birthplaces. They're all so different. And I think on that trip, we went to the 7 birthplaces in Ohio. We went to the Beatles Festival in Louisville, Kentucky. Then I figured there's one more birthplace I have to see. We're in Kentucky. We got to go to the granddaddy of all the birthplaces and go see where Lincoln was born. Go see the log cabin where he was born. And that's the one birthplace that I really did know something about going into this.
Okay.
So pulling up to Lincoln's birthplace, I expected to see this little log cabin. And instead, for those people that have been there, there's this massive neoclassical structure that looked like it was almost taken from Rome and dropped in the middle of Kentucky to commemorate where Lincoln was born. And I think at that point, it dawned on me, this would be a really interesting book to research all of the presidential birthplaces. And that's kind of when it started for me.
So, all right, you've become an author because the idea just came to you in terms of this would be a great book. But I mean, in school, did you write books or any kind of how did you make that leap from, whoa, this is a great road trip to now I'm going to be an author?
I always wanted to write a book, but no, I've never written before. I've tried my hand at writing some fiction, but never got more than a couple of paragraphs into it. What I do love is researching, and that's what I always liked. And even as a kid, and it kind of like these pieces, they connect later on when you're thinking back, how did I get here? And I remembered back as a child in like elementary school, just loving researching about animals. I'd pick an animal and I'd just find every fact that I can find about that animal and try to craft it into some sort of narrative, but it was probably more like a Wikipedia article of just fact after fact after fact. But I love that researching. And that's what really hooked me on the presidential birthplaces. Because, like, unlike other historic sites, birthplaces are very unique. Because most historic sites, like Mount Vernon or Gettysburg Battlefield, something important happens there, and then it's commemorated. And so everything is preserved the way that it was at that time when the important event happened. But with a presidential birthplace, nobody knows that person's going to grow up to be president. So it's not until like 50, 60 years later that people go back and try to find the birthplace. And by that point, a lot of these birthplaces had changed. Lincoln's log cabin was long gone by that point. George Washington's birthplace had burned down. Other birthplaces, Harry Truman's birthplace, other people moved into the home because most of the presidents were born in homes as well, too. Up until Jimmy Carter, he was the first one born in a hospital.
Wow. So all right. So what was it like for you now? It's one thing to be a researcher, it's another thing to be a writer, and most times you have to do both. What was it like now getting into the writing process of putting all this information down in terms of putting it in book format?
It was relatively new for me to do that. One thing that was interesting, I kind of did it in secret at first. Because I hadn't written a book, I didn't want to go around telling everyone I had this great idea to write a book because I thought maybe it would be like other interests where they'd kind of peter out after a while. And then people would keep asking me, how's that book going?
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
So I was probably doing it for about 3 or 4 months before I even told my wife that I was going to write a book.
That's right. That's exactly what it is. That's why sometimes it is more beneficial to just hold off before you start making the announcement, because that's exactly, unless, because there's a flip side to that. If you want to make sure that somebody else is going to pester you like that, to hold yourself accountable, because some people will do it just the opposite. I'm going to tell everybody to make sure I don't back out of it.
That's true.
But
that does help motivate you sometimes.
But to your point, it's like, no, you know what? I might decide not to do this, and now I'm gonna have egg on my face. Like so. So yes, I get it. You know what I find interesting in terms of a book like yours or a topic like yours? It's one that very few people would probably just give thought to in terms of, okay, the presidents had to be born. So, but there's only like now 46 of them. There's only been 46 presidents in the history of our country.
Yeah.
So have you looked at all 46 birthplaces?
Yeah, I'm a completist.
Okay.
So my presidential birthplaces book is about every president's birthplace. And my second book, The President is Dead, The Extraordinary Story of the Presidential Death, that's about every president who has died. And even the presidents that haven't died, I write about their prospective burial locations.
Right. It's only like Jimmy Carter. You just mentioned Jimmy Carter. I just saw the other day, he's the longest living president. So most of them either have gone or they're about to go, one or the other, so interesting.
It's inevitable.
It's inevitable. You're right. But it's just like the fact that you would even think in terms of, I'm going to do a book about all of the birthplaces. I mean, you said you love doing research. How was it doing the research for that? I mean, was it something like, all right, talk to me a little bit about doing the research, and then who was the toughest one to find?
Well, that's one of the reasons that I held off on telling people, because I didn't know if there was compelling stories for all of these presidential birthplaces. With Lincoln, with Washington, they're going to be fascinating stories. But with Martin Van Buren, is that going to be interesting? Or for William Henry Harrison? But what I found is that almost all of them do have these fascinating stories, and many of them are very quirky stories, too, because, again, there's this effort to recreate the birthplace after all of these years, when in many cases it's long gone. And some of them are pretty strange stories. And I just found that there was enough material to write about all of the presidential birthplaces.
Do you find that they tend to put their presidential libraries where their birthplaces are, or not connected at all?
In some cases, it's connected. FDR's presidential library is at his birthplace. Richard Nixon is as well, too. But for many of the presidents, like Grover Cleveland, I'm on the board for Grover Cleveland's birthplace. He only lived in his birthplace for a couple of years. He was a toddler when he moved out. So for many of these presidents, their birthplace doesn't have that much relevance. And one of the more interesting ones was Andrew Jackson, because Andrew Jackson didn't even know where he was born. And he didn't know if he was born in North Carolina or if he was born in South Carolina. And at the time he was born, they were still colonies, and the borders weren't quite defined yet. And he had aunts that lived on both sides of the border, and his mother moved around because his father had died before he was born. So in both states, you can go there and see this is where Andrew Jackson was born in North Carolina, and then you go to South Carolina, you can see another marker, this is where Andrew Jackson was born. So there's a lot of those really strange stories with the birthplaces.
Again, it's fascinating. This sounds almost like, I'm sitting here as I'm listening to you thinking, this almost sounds like a Jeopardy category. It sounds like something that would be, Alex Trebek would be, and I know Alex is gone, but back in his time whenever he was there, and I don't know the new host's name right now, but it sounds like something, it would be like a presidential birthplace for $100 or what have you, something on Jeopardy. I mean, because it is something that we don't think about in terms of on a daily basis, and I love that, by the way. I mean, my whole blog is on that. The blog and podcast that I do, not the radio show per se, but my blog and podcast is to kind of come up with things I observed that the average person probably wouldn't think about. And so that's, to me, this topic is like something like the average, everyday, ordinary Joe trying to survive is not thinking about where the presidents were born. However,
I am.
They come across a book like that, and now it piques the curiosity. Like, never thought about it before, but now that, you just gave something about the 7 presidents that were born in Ohio. See, that's for me, I didn't know that. So these are also like fun facts, kind of like something that you didn't know, but now after you heard it, like now I'll know 7 presidents were born in Ohio. Didn't know that. So in terms of now, you're doing the research, you're putting it in book form. What was like, because you said some of them were really quirky. What were some of the quirkier ones?
Well, Abraham Lincoln's, like I mentioned, the log cabin that he was born in was long gone by the time he became president. But it became such an iconic symbol of Abraham Lincoln. About 30 years after he died, after he was assassinated, a couple of men purchased the land where Abraham Lincoln was born. And these guys were almost like the P.T. Barnum of their day. So they were showmen. And they figured they purchased the land, they can bill it, come see the place where Abraham Lincoln was born, and people would flock there. So they purchased the land, but nobody came. It's kind of tough to get there back in the 1890s. It's kind of tough to get there now, but back in the 1890s, right, it was really tough. So they figured people wanted to see the log cabin. So one of them told the other, go find the log cabin where Abraham Lincoln was born. Forget about the fact that it's been gone for 50 years before Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. This guy went out, found a log cabin, and built it as the log cabin where Abraham Lincoln was born. And people believed it. And they came there to see the log cabin where Abraham Lincoln was born. Later on, it became a national park site. The national park site built it. These are the authentic logs where in the home where Abraham Lincoln was born. It wasn't until years later when they first started to question the site and realized they've since done like carbon dating on the logs and determined that it's not the log cabin where Abraham Lincoln was born. But for years, people revered these logs almost like
because
it was the
that's
Holy
what they
Cross.
were being told.
Yeah.
You say, no, these are not the logs.
Yeah.
Wow.
And the story's even stranger. I won't go into it, but
Yeah,
for a
go
while,
into it.
for a while, the log cabin was taken on display too. So they put it on a train and they brought it around to different World's Fairs so people can see it. Bring the log cabin to them. Then they found that the birthplace of Jefferson Davis was up for sale. So they purchased the log cabin of Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, put the log cabin side by side, would bring them around to different World's Fairs. They'd build the log cabins, put them on display. After the World's Fair was over, they'd take the log cabins down, put them on a train, take them to the next fair. After a while, the logs started to get intermingled. Eventually, the log cabin found its way to Coney Island, and it was on display at Coney Island for a couple of years. So just really weird story. But that's the kind of stories that I love.
So were there any other states that it seemed like there was a trend like Ohio, or was it just really scattered? Are they, okay, given when everything happened, like you said, the colonization and so forth and so on, like we were predominantly East Coast, like the West Coast came in second. So did you find most of them were born on the East, or moved to, like, what was the trend there?
Yeah, the trend kind of follows the story of America. There was 8 presidents born in Virginia. So the Virginia dynasty, the first presidents, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe. So 4 of the first 5 presidents were born in Virginia. So if you're on the East Coast and you're listening and you want to go visiting the presidential birthplaces, you've got plenty right here on the East Coast within a day trip that you can go see. But then as the country moves west, so do the presidential birthplaces. So Abraham Lincoln becomes the first president born in the western regions, outside of the first 13 original colonies. So as the country is growing, so the presidents become more diverse. And then you have Barack Obama, born in Ohio, shortly after, born in Hawaii.
Right.
Barack Obama, born in Hawaii, just a couple of years after that becomes a state. So it's interesting, the story of the presidential birthplaces somewhat coincides with the story of America.
Well, it makes sense. In terms of doing your research, where did you find out all the information, or how did you find all the information?
Visiting the presidential birthplaces was part of it, so I'd visited all of the presidential birthplaces and doing my research. But Also, the ones under the National Park Service have a ton of history written about them, and a ton of research that's been done. But a lot of it was visiting archives. On the internet, there's a ton of information out there, and I don't mean on Wikipedia, but on like archive.org. You can find old books that have been digitized from the 1800s on newspapers. There's digitized newspapers. So there's a ton you can do in your home on the computer for researching, but there's nothing like visiting the places.
Correct.
When you're writing about historic sites.
Now, wait a minute. We were talking before we came into the booth about folks teasing me about, wait a minute, you get up at 4 o'clock on a Saturday morning to do something that you're not paid to do. Is this a passion for you or something you were paid to do?
Well, it's a passion for me. I eventually, in selling the books.
Right, in selling the book. Right, that's
Yeah,
the,
yeah.
But I mean, prior to...
No, this was...
Right, okay. That's
Yeah. Yeah, no, this was a passion. And similar to you, one day I woke up 4 o'clock in the morning to drive about 5 hours north to go see the site where Millard Fillmore was born. But Millard Fillmore, the log cabin, isn't even there anymore. So it's just like a footprint of a log cabin. But to me, that was worth it to wake up 4 o'clock in the morning to see.
Absolutely. No, see, that's the thing. We were talking about this before we came on the air. In terms of, like, if you have a passion like that, the money piece does not always have to translate into the actual green dollar or, money's in your wallet. This is my passion. This is what I'm interested in. There are side benefits or other benefits from it. So just the fact that you visited is, I mean, because I know when I visit historic sites, depending on really what the significance they have for me, I can feel it on the inside. I mean, it was like when I one morning, and I had been to the tomb of Martin Luther King before, but one morning I went down there. It was around 6 in the morning, and I got down there. The sun was coming up. It was just the weirdest, strangest feeling to step down there in front of his tomb. It was almost as if, for lack of a better term, I was on holy ground. It was like I just felt like that. Do you get that feeling as you go to these various sites saying, wow, this is where such and such was born? This is where, and we're going to get to the death book shortly, but do you like, is it like I'm actually in the spot where President such and such was born?
Yeah. You know what, there's that Hamilton play where they sing about being in the room where it happened. And that's what it feels like when you're stepping on those wooden planks and you're in the homes where either a president was born or a president lived, or any sort of historic site, going back to the Gettysburg battlefield. When you're on that historic site where these events happened, and you can kind of, like, in your mind, it's almost like a time machine. You're in the present, but you're also kind of looking at the past, too. It's like you start seeing in black and white all of a sudden.
It's almost like even though they're not there, that's why I know the spirit is there or what have you, but it's almost like even though they're not physically there, you still get this connection.
Yep.
With whoever it is that you're studying or researching or whoever the figure was.
Yeah.
I've had the opportunity, interestingly enough, I have the opportunity to visit a lot of the various grave sites, because we'll talk about the death piece shortly. Mm-hmm. But a lot of the various graves, JFK, RFK, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, I mean, I'm one of those that people think are weird anyway, because I like to visit cemeteries. And so once I find out where their plot is, if the cemetery is somewhere, I will drive to it just like that, and just to be able to go and say, wow, this person, I'm at the grave site of this particular individual. Joe Louis, I mean, I can go right on down the list, a long list of folks I've been at their grave. If you go up to New York, there's a cemetery up there where a lot of the famous people are buried. Judy Garland is there, Malcolm X is there, a bunch of notable folks are there. Actors, actresses, athletes. Langston Hughes is there. James Baldwin is there. I mean, it's just, the list is long. I think it's Fernwood. I always have to look it up because I get the name mixed up. Mm-hmm. But just to go, and that's where their physical bodies lie, but you still can connect with this. Interestingly enough, because my listening audience, you all know I'm about themes. So since I knew Lewis was coming on with me, I have this necklace this morning. This ancestor history necklace. That's why I'm wearing it, because we were interviewing this morning, so that's why I put it on. But it's a necklace that I have of all trinkets and whatever they call those things whenever you put them on a necklace, pendants or what have you, that represent something ancestral or historical. And so this morning when I got up, I said, you know what, I'm going to wear this necklace to the interview for the very fact that we're talking about history. Because like I said earlier, history is so important. And people don't understand the significance of history in terms of knowing where you've been, where you are, and where you're going. And many people will tell you that once you know history, hopefully, I mean, if it's good history, yeah, repeat it. But if it's bad history, don't. Learn from it, learn from the mistakes, and don't repeat it.
But you got to know it.
But you got to know it. Yeah. Bingo. There you go. And that's where I'm going with it in terms of a lot of people try to blow off the importance of history. And what we're telling you is find something, you know, because I'm big on behind the scenes. That's why I love autobiographies, because what you see in front of the camera is a totally different thing of what really went on once they left the camera. And I'm fascinated by that. Like when I read presidential biographies, when they talk about how they got back in the White House and cursed everybody out, that's the kind of stuff I'm interested in. Because on the camera, they were smiling and everything was great. Then they get back in the White House and they curse the staff out. But again, that's where history comes in. And it's a shame, and I don't want to take it to the political piece, but that's why it's a shame where now you have folks trying to ban books, trying to ban history from folks. History, it is what it is. You can't act as if these things didn't happen. You can't say, well, we're not going to tell you about that part. We need to know all of it.
I agree. Yep. And it's not all pleasant. But
it's not all pleasant, right? Yep. But we need to know it. That's the thing.
We're adults. We can handle it.
It happened, so we need to know it. So therefore, you don't repeat it again, what have you. But you can't turn around and say, well, we're not going to tell you this part, but we'll tell you this part. We need to know all of it. So that everybody get a clear and round picture. So listening audience, if you don't know who you're listening to, this is your host, Marc Medley. My guest this morning is Louis L. Picone, and we're talking about his various books and his passion for history. And I agree with that in terms of the history and the social studies. And working with kids every day, I know how they kind of like it. I do have some kids who are history buffs. I have had kids who are history buffs. But for the most part, a lot of the kids are like, we don't need to know that. That was like 50 years ago. Kid, 50 years ago was not that long.
No.
And then when you go like, okay, that was 100 years ago, they really like, I don't need to know. Then when you get into the thousands of years ago, But in any event, that's what we're talking about this morning. And Louis is the best-selling, award-winning author of Grant's Tomb, The Epic Death of Ulysses S. Grant. Let's talk a little bit, because you said the epic death. What made that death epic?
Well, Grant was known as the general to win the Civil War, the epic battle of winning the Civil War. But from a personal perspective, perhaps his most epic battle was his death. So to bring it back a year, Grant died on July 23rd, 1885. I start my book about a year earlier than that. And I kind of look at my book as almost like a sequel to the Grant biographies. So I kind of pick up right around the time when the Grant biographies end with his death. But about a year prior to Grant's death in 1884, at the time, Grant was probably the most beloved figure in America, if not the world. And he was the one person who could really unify the country. And this was a generation after the Civil War, 1884, 1885, in the Gilded Age, when the country was still greatly divided. Again, knowing that history, you like to think that Civil War ended, slavery was abolished, everything's happy. But that wasn't the case. Reconstruction had these great promises of Reconstruction, but ultimately failed in many of those promises, unfulfilled until the civil rights movements of the 60s. And the country was still sharply divided, North and South, Democrat, Republican, in many ways just like today. But Grant was the one person that can bring all those factions together. He was kind of like, in a way, above politics, even though he was president. And even though he defeated the South, he had defeated the South on famously generous terms. He was magnanimous, is the one word that's always associated with Grant, that he was magnanimous in victory. And he understood that defeating the South wasn't like defeating another country, that you're basically welcoming, you weren't conquering the South. You were welcoming them back into the American political family, the white Southerners, as well as now 4 million freed, enslaved individuals. So trying to piece together this fractured country. So even though the country remained sharply divided a generation after the Civil War, Northerners, Southerners, Democrats, Republican, black, white, rich, poor, immigrants, native, they all loved Grant. He was the one person, perhaps the only person in the country that everyone loved. And after he was president, he took a world tour, 2.5 years, traveled the world. So, and everywhere he went, he was treated like a returning hero. Circumnavigated the globe. He was like Magellan. And so he was probably the most beloved figure in the world when he died. So a year before he died, he was on top of the world. He was healthy and wealthy. And first he finds out that he had become wealthy by investing in a firm that was managed by a shady individual who was returning enormous profits in the Gilded Age. And in May 1884, everything collapsed, and he realized that he'd fallen victim to what would later be known as a Ponzi scheme, or now as a Bernie Madoff scheme.
Exactly, because that's what came to mind when you said that. I'm thinking of Bernie Madoff. That's exactly what came to mind.
I know. For years you said Ponzi scheme. Now we have to rebrand it. So first he finds out he's bankrupt, that the millions that he had were all on a paper financial statement, and he's bankrupt. A couple months later, he has a pain in his throat, kind of disregards it, finally goes to the doctor a couple months later, and he's diagnosed with inoperable throat cancer. And cancer in the 1880s is a veritable death sentence. Correct. So he went from healthy and wealthy to bankrupt and on his deathbed, really.
Right. I mean, I'm sitting here, and that's just how quickly, folks, things can turn.
Yep. Just
listening to that, that's just healthy and wealthy one minute, and next minute broke and struggling with a health challenge the next. So I'm sitting. See, this is a history lesson for me, and hopefully, and I tell you all the time here on the Reading Circle that I wanted to be entertaining, I wanted to be fun, but I also wanted to be educational and informational. This morning is more of like a history lesson because I'm learning things as I'm sitting here listening. Either I learned them before in school and forgot them, or never learned them at all. I don't know which, but that's fascinating. Keep going.
Yep. So this begins his epic battle. Now, he loved his wife and he loved his family, and he didn't want to leave them bankrupt. He didn't want to die with them having to bear the burdens of his financial mistakes. So for years, publishers had been after him to write his memoirs. Kind of Civil War memoirs by this point had become like a cottage industry, where everyone from the privates up to the generals were writing memoirs, and they become very popular. Grant was kind of like the white whale that all the publishers wanted. So now he figures this is his way to write himself out of poverty, but he's got limited time, and he doesn't know how much time he has. So he begins this quest, and one of his friends get involved, who's probably the second most popular person in the country at the time, Mark Twain. And Twain offers him a generous contract under his new publishing company, because he's just started a publishing company. So the first book that Twain publishes is Huck Finn. The second one is Grant's memoirs. Grant goes on this epic battle, 8 months, writing his memoirs, as he's suffering, and he's in incredible pain, and he's struggling to sleep, he's struggling to swallow, he's losing weight, but he just has this fortitude for finishing his memoirs because he knows why he needs to finish the memoirs. Plus, he wants to tell his story too. So after a while, his doctors start to realize that the memoirs are the only thing keeping him alive. There's a couple of close calls where they don't think Grant's going to make it, but he keeps forging ahead. And one doctor writes, I'm nervous when Grant's finished the memoirs that he's going to lose the will to live. He finishes the memoirs on around July 19th, 1885, 4 days later, he passes away. The memoirs, now Grant wasn't a writer, and Grant didn't think he was a very good writer, and he didn't think people would want to listen to him. He was an incredibly humble individual, and he had no writing experience. The memoirs become the #1 bestseller and make him, posthumously, the best-selling author of all time. He gets royalty checks beyond any other author in history. And so he manages to take care of his family, and he wins his epic battle.
There were so many thoughts that were going through mine as you were talking. One, when I started the school year off, we had the first 2 days, our teachers had to go into professional development. The first day was with me, the second day was with the district. But I started my professional development off with a question, and it's the title of a book by Simon Sinek. What is your why? And I'm sitting there listening to you that at that point, Grant had a why.
Yep.
And that why is what kept him alive, as well as the opportunity for him to take care of his family after he was gone. Mm-hmm. Wow. Fascinating story. So those are the type of things, like when you're a researcher and you connect the research with your passion, those are the kind of things you can learn. Because like I said, my goal, particularly on a show like this morning, is to actually be educational. And I can tell you, as I always tell you, if nobody else was educated, I'm being educated as I'm sitting here. If you would like to, if you have a question, you want to call in, he is here. Lewis is here live with me in the studio. The number is 973-720-2738. If you have a question, something you've heard, or either on, if you know anything about the presidents that you might not know, I think you might not know, or you might think Lewis might know, give us a call, 973-720-2738. I tell you all the time, just because the phone is not ringing does not mean people are not listening, because for the most part, I don't call radio shows either, so I get it. I understand. If you don't call, I get it. Folks get nervous, but if you do have a question, 973-720-2738. So that was with Ulysses S. Grant. Fascinating. That was just that little synopsis that I call, the Cliff Notes version.
And I should mention, too, that to this day, that's considered one of the best presidential memoirs in history.
Now, see, now you're going to make me have to read it. I have close to 2,000 books in here, but you're going to make me find that one. Because now you piqued my curiosity. The President is Dead. Ulysses S. Grant in the Making of an American Pantheon. The President is Dead. The Extraordinary Stories of the Presidential Death. So since we're there, final days, burials, and beyond. Let's talk. What we got there we had the birth side.
Yep.
So what's going on the death side?
Yeah, so that was actually the second book I wrote. The first book I wrote was The Presidential Birthplaces.
Right.
And as I'm writing that book, like my friends would keep joking around, oh, what are you going to write about the next, where they died? And meanwhile, I was thinking about writing that book, but I didn't want to, tell them yes, because then it's like they're thinking that they gave me the idea.
Of course.
But in researching the presidential birthplaces, I found so much information about their graves. So that became my second book. Now, the first book, I kind of focused more on the sites, on the places where they were born, because there's not much stories to the presidential birth. There's fascinating stories of the places. But so when I decided to write about the deaths, first I was focused on the graves, but I realized that there's incredible stories in the president's final days, in their death, how they died, and their public mourning, how the public reacted to their deaths. So that became my second book, which is The President is Dead, The Extraordinary Stories of Their Deaths, Final Days, Burials, and Beyond. And again, like the first book, I wrote about all the presidents. When it came out in 2016, Gerald Ford was the last president who had died. 2018, George H.W. Bush had passed away. So my second edition came out in 2020. And so, from that, just the stories of their deaths, I just found so fascinating. So I write about their deaths and their graves and the public mourning. It's kind of wrapped up.
Well, see, again, people think I'm weird, and I'm okay with that. Because at one point I considered being a mortician. And so I'm fascinated with death, yes. I am fascinated with the whole death and dying and all of that, because I really did. That was one business. I would tell people all the time, I still tell people all the time, I really have a hard time visiting folks in the hospital because I hate to see folks suffering, but I have no problem with going in the funeral home or down in the morgue or what have you when they're dead. And no problem dealing with folks dead, but sick and suffering, it just does something to me. But funeral homes, death, and all this, that doesn't matter. When my father passed away, I had the opportunity to assist in his embalming. And so like I said, so out of all of them, the president's death that I've studied the most would be, of course, John F. Kennedy. His I've studied the most. But what are that one is public. We're going to get to that one in a minute. But what are some of the other, these for me are like fun facts. And I see we do have a caller on the line. These are like fun facts for me in terms of things that I just did not know. And so, good morning, caller. You're on the air.
These are like fun facts for me in terms of
caller, you have to turn your radio down for one.
I just did not know. And so, good morning, caller. You're on the air.
Good morning, Mark. This is Robinson.
Good morning, Miss Robinson. How are you?
I'm good. I'm sitting here listening to the guest about Grant. Okay, the guest. I have a question for you.
Mm-hmm.
I never liked history, but I like the history of the Bible. When I really got into that, it gave me a lot of reason to know the history. Now, my question to you is, when Grant wrote the book, even though he was in pain, his reason was to leave his family not with a lot of debt.
Correct.
But it was a reason because he was concerned about other people.
Correct.
You know?
Yep.
That has really inspired me. Our life is about other people.
Yep.
Yeah, you know what? That's why when you were listening to Lewis say that he was known around the world as being magnanimous, that even in the victory of the war, he still was making peace in terms of, okay, yeah, we won, but, now let's pull this thing back together.
Yep. And even in his book, that was still part of the motivation to bring the country back together. And Grant was an incredibly decent person. He was, didn't partake in even the casual racism of the day. And you can see that with the former enslaved, with black Americans, also with Mexicans. When during the Mexican-American War, he thought very highly of the Mexican citizens. He even nations where the individuals, they might have been impoverished, he always would blame it on the government. Never saw that in any failings of the people. And you can see this when he traveled the world. When he went to Egypt and China and Japan, he always had this incredible respect for the people that he met.
And see, that's where I think Ms. Robinson's caller is going in terms of his outlook on human beings. Mm-hmm. And the fact that you said during his day, didn't get caught up in the racism, so he really was out there for the most part on his own.
Yeah.
Because there wasn't many like that. That's not to say he was the only one, but there weren't many, and especially in a leadership position.
Yep.
He really was out there for the most part.
So, Ms. Robinson, thank you so much for the call. Your statement, your commentary, and your question is exactly on point, is what you do for other people. And that was his why. As we were talking about, it became his why as he wrote the book. And you heard Lewis say he died, 4 days after?
4 days after, yep.
4 days later.
He just really willed himself to survive, to finish this book, and to take care of his family.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for
point.
the call. Thank you for the question. And continue and keep on listening. Thanks again for being a great listener.
Great. I love it.
All right.
Thank you.
All right, just like Ms. Robinson, and by the way, Lestine is one of our faithful listeners. She listens every Saturday morning. She has an opportunity to listen. I'm so glad she called in. The number is 973-720-2738, and she was absolutely correct. Part of Ulysses S. Grant's success was the fact that he did have the compassion in the heart, and he was humble for other people. It's about what you do for other people, and that's the first word Lewis said about him was magnanimous.
Yep.
All right, so in terms of the deaths, that's where we were going before. And caller, again, feel free, call in. If you have any questions, thoughts, concerns, emotional outbursts, give us a call. 973-720-2738. Looks like somebody's calling Lewis on his phone.
That's not how you do it.
So, I mean, like I said, the most famous death, clearly, one of the most famous, got to be one of it, is JFK's because it was an assassination. But there was more than one presidential assassination. JFK was not the only one assassinated.
Well, yeah, you're right. There was 4 of them.
There we go.
So Abraham Lincoln was the first president assassinated, and the other 3, James Garfield, 1881, and William McKinley in 1901. But Abraham Lincoln, maybe I can talk about him for a little bit. So when he died kind of similar to FDR, where it was towards the end of this major war. But with Abraham Lincoln, the war, for all intent and purposes, the war was won. And after 4 years of hardship and really of this tough presidency, which was he started the presidency. Virtually his entire presidency was during wartime. He was a wartime president. So finally, he gets to exhale, and the war is over. He gets to celebrate. He can start thinking about reconstructing the country. And he even, on the day he's assassinated, he's talking to Mary Todd on a carriage ride. He's talking to his wife, saying, "You know what? We need to be happier." They started to talk about traveling after the president. He wanted to visit the Holy Land. So he had these grand plans about finally he can think about something else. Now that the war is over, April 14th, he's assassinated by John Wilkes Booth in Ford's Theater. The outpouring of national grief was unprecedented at the time. One, because he was so beloved in the North, and on death, he almost became sanctified as this holy martyr. He became he became somewhat immortal in death, and the outpouring of grief was unprecedented. Now, also, you had mentioned embalming earlier, so there's this juxtaposition of this historic moment, this outpouring of grief, but also the advent of technology that had occurred during the Civil War with the advancements of railroads and telegraphs and embalming. Embalming was a practice that had gone back thousands of years, but during the Civil War, with 800,000 deaths, it became really perfected. And embalming turned into big business. They would kind of set up shops by the battlefields, and soldiers can sign up in advance, almost like an insurance policy. If I don't make it out of this battle, pay in advance, get embalmed, send me back to my home. Don't bury me on the battlefield. So embalming, the practice became perfected somewhat, or much improved during the Civil War. So when Lincoln dies, first question is, and it almost always is the family's choice, is where is the president going to be buried? So Mary Todd wanted him buried in Springfield, Illinois. That was their home. That was the only home that they had together. That's where they planned on returning after the presidency. Lincoln would have just become a lawyer again after the presidency back in Springfield. So she decides she wants him buried in Springfield, but that's like 1,000 miles away from Washington, D.C., so how are they going to get the body there? Considering this outpouring of grief and this strong urge for the public to see the president one last time, the planners come up with this idea of this prolonged public mourning where Lincoln was the first president embalmed, so they had open casket viewings all throughout the country. This massive funeral train, which lasted 20 days from the day that Abraham Lincoln died until he was placed in a crypt in Springfield, Illinois. This was 20 days. He was above ground, and he was also put on display. The funeral train would go from city to city. There would be a massive procession in each of the cities to all of the town leaders and fraternal organizations and military organizations would escort the coffin from the funeral train to the most prominent building in the city and open up the casket, public display. They would, after several hours, sometimes more than a day of public viewing, they would have the funeral procession go back to the train, and then the train would go on to the next town. And as these cities further down the line were hearing about what was happening in these cities that had the public mourning already, they would want to one-up them. So they kept getting bigger and more elaborate the further the train went. So it was just unprecedented. Nothing like that has ever been seen in America, has ever been seen since. I doubt it ever will be seen again.
No, they probably, because I think they kind of sort of tried to replicate it during its time when they did that with Ronald Reagan. He was on the plane, though. He wasn't on the train. He was on the plane. They went to different cities. They kind of did something very similar.
Yeah, but not open casket anymore.
Right.
You won't see that anymore. And the embalmers traveled with the train. The funeral directors would travel with the train because embalming was much improved, but it wasn't perfected.
Right.
And so they would need to keep touching up Lincoln throughout this long funeral procession. And newspapers were in some ways much less tactful than they are today,
right.
which is kind of hard to believe.
Exactly.
But when you read how they describe the remains, it's horrifying to read about this. And very detailed, very lurid, how they would describe the features, the color, and it was just so. That's one of the more fascinating stories.
Well, see, again, I'm just sitting here listening, and he can see me as like my mouth would drop open a couple of times, and then the expressions on my face. Because see, that's the kind of things when I say historically, and when you start talking biographies, that's what I'm talking about when I say behind the scenes. That's the kind of, like, I know what we saw. Like he said, you know what you saw on the train. You know what you saw if you came upon the body. There's another thing to know everything that went into that.
Yeah.
That everything that, like you were just saying, like, we didn't know the embalmers or the morticians were traveling with them. That's the kind of details and stuff like that, for me, like, I get, like, excited about. Because it's stuff like that, you just, one, you don't get thought to. Two, you don't see. And you don't, until somebody really gets into the behind-the-scenes work of something, that's when you get a real appreciation for what you saw. You had no idea of what it went through to get there. I'm going to say something in a minute. It's off topic, but just to illustrate my point. Whenever I was working in marketing, whenever I was doing my corporate job, I was in marketing. And up until that point, until I had that job, when I got a piece of what we call quote-unquote junk mail, as soon as I got it, I tossed it in the garbage. When I started being in the process of creating that junk mail, of knowing everything that had to go into it, and when I tell you folks, when you get a piece of mail that's what we consider junk mail, there is a long and lengthy process to get that piece to your mailbox. The coding and this decision, that decision. I had a new appreciation for what we call junk mail. All right. I'm saying all that to say that as I go through history and learn the behind the scenes, I get a new and better appreciation for what was seen.
Yeah. And you're going to make me feel guilty for throwing out junk mail now.
I still throw it out now, but I do know the process that goes into it.
But you're right, though. As a researcher, those are like details like that is what I just get so passionate about, and what I just really enjoy. And it's like these light bulbs start going off when you're doing that research, and you're cross-referencing the newspapers with diaries that have been written, with other accounts. So that's the stuff that I really enjoy to research. And also I like to think that I'm writing in a style for books that I like to read, because that's what I like to read too. That's what, you're right. Kind of like that behind the scenes and those details that you won't get in textbooks, and maybe you shouldn't get in textbooks. But to me, it just makes them fascinating stories and gripping stories.
Well, it is. Just the fact that you said, because I didn't know that part, and I've read the Lincoln piece, the assassination with that and all that as well. I didn't know the piece about the conversation you were just saying about him and Mary Todd was saying, well, you know what, let's be happy, the war's over, let's concentrate, and the whole notion of, okay, we're going to just go back to Springfield, we're going to be a normal couple. That I didn't know.
Yeah.
That's the kind of stuff, to me, I don't know about you in the listening audience, but for me, that kind of stuff really is fascinating in terms of what were they thinking? I'm always go back to, it's one thing because you can't see a person's thoughts. It's one thing to see what you see on camera or in the public eye. It's another thing to really get a feel for what was going through their mind and what they were thinking when these events were occurring.
Yeah, and maybe not so much now with our modern presidents, but historic presidents at the time, and still now we tend to put them on pedestals and think about them as marble figures and think about Lincoln as the face on the penny, and yeah, like the Lincoln Memorial, this wise man that knows all and sees all. But they were people, and I think we see so much of that humanity in their deaths too.
Yes,
because they're not being public figures. They're with their family and they're suffering, and they're thinking about their life legacy. So yeah, to me, it's a fascinating perspective.
Well, that's an extremely good point, because you're right. We do canonize and put folks on pedestals and the other. And at the end of the day, they really are human like all the rest of us, and they go through the same things that we go through.
Yep.
And that's I think fascinating. We keep using the word fascinating, but I mean, I think that to me is like really thought-provoking, because again, any of us at any given time, like you said, the presidents, they didn't know where they were going to be born. So that made it the birthplace. But at the time they were being born, they didn't know they were going to be president. All right. Any of us at any given time could have been in that particular situation. All right, and everything that we do, we're all leaders in our own rights, this, that, and the other. But at the end of the day, we're all human as well. And we all go through, like he said, now, when he was talking about Ulysses S. Grant with the cancer, okay, a lot of people don't think stuff can happen to famous people. A lot of people, they don't think, like you said, he went broke. A lot of people didn't think famous people go broke. So yes.
Yeah. Or you think they've got somehow superior means to deal with these situations than we have. But yeah, they're humans. And I think, like you said, like you like autobiographies and biographies in a way that deconstructs them and that makes them more human. When you can see those moments of how they're treating their White House staff and how they're talking to their spouses. And you can also see how their story evolves over time too, and how you can see inconsistencies in their writing, because they're just like us.
Right.
When you
right. No, you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
I get the biggest kick out of knowing, okay, I saw them deliver that address, and then go read about how they felt about it when they got back. Mm-hmm. When they got back in their room, or they got back in the White House or wherever, how they thought about it. Because they were smiling on camera, but when they got back in the room, it was like, I really messed that up. Can you believe I did that? Can you believe I said that? Yeah, it's like, yeah. So I see here you've been featured on C-SPAN, Time Magazine, BBC News, NPR, Washington Post, New York Times, and Travel Channel. How did all that come about?
Geez, how did it come about? What was surprising for me is, just the doors that have been open to me as an author. I should maybe just start with that, because I've been so lucky and so blessed, and sometimes I'll find myself in a situation and wonder again, like, how did I get here? Like that situation in Russia. I attended, this was 2016, it was an international conference with presidential historians from America, traveled to Russia and met with Russian historians, where it was just a conference, and it was kind of like a back and forth, where there would be presentations delivered about Russian leaders as well as presentations delivered about the presidents. And just from writing my first book, I was invited. The organizer had read my book, and he wanted me invited to that conference. And I was like, how did I get here? And every time something like this happens, I was interviewed by Time Magazine when Donald Trump had announced his candidacy for 2024, because he became the first president since Grover Cleveland to attempt, or Grover Cleveland was the only president who had non-consecutive terms. So Donald Trump was trying to duplicate what Grover Cleveland has done, and being on the board for the Grover Cleveland Birthplace, and we're now creating the Grover Cleveland Presidential Library there in Caldwell. I was interviewed by Time Magazine, and it was just fascinating for me that they would interview me, and it was an honor.
I'm sitting here laughing because I know exactly what Lewis is talking about. If I send out an email or an invitation just under my own name, Marc Medley, I may or may not get a response. But if I put Marc Medley, talk radio show host, totally different. So when you put Louis Picone, author, and what the author is about, totally different response. It really is. That's why when he's saying that, I'm laughing because I know exactly what he's talking about. Because you're doing it. Wow. One, I'm glad you heard about me. But secondly, the fact that you would ask me to be on it, I mean, it really is. But it becomes with, like I said, what you do in terms of the writing and everything. Yeah. So the last piece in terms of, before we get ready to go into the opportunity for you to promote in any manner you wish, except a dollar amount. And I told you, I am a major JFK fan. I really am. I mean, JFK and MLK, I'm just, you want to talk about like that's my area of research, the whole 60s. I was a baby in the 60s. I was born in 1962. So when everything was happening, I was like an infant. But I'm really into that from like 1960 up to 1970, that time frame. It's just so much chaos was going on in the 60s.
And you probably didn't realize it at the time.
No. Yeah. Not as a kid. I really didn't. But it was so much chaos going on. I have my mother, we have a picture of us down at, it's like 63, 64. It was after the assassination, down in Arlington Memorial Cemetery. I was like maybe 2 or 3. And I was standing next to her. They had gone down to see the gravesite. But I see here it was an American mystery on the travel to discuss the mystery of JFK's missing brain. Now, I don't know if you're a conspiracy theorist or not, but I am. Unashamedly, unapologetically, yes, I am a conspiracy theorist. But, I have read so much about this brain.
Oh, you have?
So
okay.
What? What did you come up with, or what was the talk about?
Well, conspiracy theories to the side. I won't get into that, but it's not a conspiracy. John F. Kennedy's brain is missing. So that's, it sounds like a conspiracy. But yeah, no, it's a fact. And in writing my second book, again, that was one of those details that I came across, that his brain was missing. And it wasn't buried with the body. It was considered evidence, and doctors continued to examine it after the body was buried. So, you want me to go into the story of the missing brain? Okay.
Yes.
So, the brain and other material from the autopsy, without getting too graphic, but tissue samples, blood samples, etc., biological evidence ended up in a box stored, believe it or not, in a file cabinet for years in the like in the Secret Service area, and it was just kind of like put aside. And Robert Kennedy found out about this in the mid-'60s, and he took the material. And there's several reasons why he would have done that. I mean, one, the obvious. It's his brother. Right. So he took the material. Later on, the National Archives determines that he needs to return the material. So there's this back and forth with a footlocker of material. And it goes to the National Archives. It goes back in Robert Kennedy's possession. It goes back to the National Archives. When they finally open it, the tissue is there, the blood sample is there, the X-ray slides are there. The brain isn't there. And nobody really asked Robert Kennedy for the brain. He's Robert Kennedy. And Robert Kennedy is assassinated in 1968. Right. And over time, anyone that kind of dealt in that transaction, like Robert Kennedy's secretary, who was kind of handling the back and forth, she passes away, and the brain is never discovered. So there's even, it's written about for the first time in the 70s There is an investigation, a federal investigation into assassinations, and it's not like a big feature. It's more an investigation into the assassination, but there's a couple of paragraphs in there on basically we believe Robert Kennedy stole the brain, and nobody knows where it is. And there's a couple of reasons, looking back, speculating, why would Robert Kennedy have stolen his brother's brain? Again, besides the obvious, but he left the other material in there. In order of the least provocative to the most provocative. So the first theory is that he didn't want it to turn into some sort of museum item. And which, if you think back to the 60s, this was right around the time when Ford's Theater was turning into an Abraham Lincoln Museum. Right. And they had John Wilkes Booth Derringer pistol there. So it wasn't totally out of the realm of possibility, although putting a brain on display is a little different. But if you go to the Mutter Museum now in Philadelphia, you've been there, you can see a piece of James Garfield's flesh, a piece from his spinal cord from the assassination. You can see, we talked about cancer with Ulysses Grant. Grover Cleveland also had a cancerous tumor removed in secrecy because he didn't want the nation to panic. This was while he was president. Right. If you want to see that cancer, go to the Mutter Museum. So, is this in Philadelphia?
Right. The thinking is not that far-fetched.
Yeah.
You could very well, like you said, come up on somebody and say, we're going to put JFK's brain on display.
Yeah.
So it's not that far off. Yeah, I agree with you.
So that was number one. He just, in just common decency, he didn't want his brother's brain put on display. So that's number one. Number two, John F. Kennedy, you look at him as this picture of vigor and youth. But he wasn't.
Not at all.
He was
nowhere close. He had the Addison's disease. He had other things going on.
Back problems.
Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And he was perhaps one of the least healthy presidents we've had.
Correct.
And he used to wear a back brace on a regular basis. You think about him playing with little John and playing touch football with his brothers. But he was in a lot of pain a lot of the time. Yep. And a lot of that was an illusion. The illusion he was trying to create.
Correct.
Almost like FDR.
Correct.
Yeah, not being seen in the wheelchair kind of harkens back to that. So he was on a lot of medication. And there was a doctor that
travel with him.
Yeah, would travel with him. He would have access to the White House that was giving him medication that worked. What was in that medication? I don't even know if John F. Kennedy knew what was in the medication, but it worked, so he was happy. But others around him were concerned about what he was taking. So the number two on the medium provocative list is that Robert Kennedy didn't want anyone in the future examining that brain and doing toxicology reports or whatever to see what his brother might have been taking, because he was concerned as well. Now, the brain was in a jar of formaldehyde, and I don't know after so many years if it still would have any sort of information to tell someone, but maybe that was a concern. Again, Robert Kennedy never admitted to taking the brain. He never talked about it. He never wrote about it. So, and he's not with us, so you have to speculate. So that's number two on the medium provocative list. Number three is the brain was considered evidence because John F. Kennedy was shot in the brain, and it's almost like Lincoln. When we were talking about that final conversation he had with Mary Todd, when you watch the film of John F. Kennedy getting assassinated, and I heard you talking about this earlier, how time condenses. On 9/11, you can think back. It's almost like it happened yesterday.
Exactly.
And I was thinking the same thing. As you were speaking about being in class, I was thinking about where I was that morning. Researching the presidents and researching these moments, and with the death, they're very, very poignant moments, and that happens to me too. And I'll get myself choked up sometimes, and like watching that film, it's very tragic. When I think about how Ulysses Grant in those final moments, or any of the presidents. It's very poignant, and kind of going back, I try to remember that as I'm writing too, that I'm writing about family members, and I've met descendants of the president too, and that kind of reminds me, I'm not writing about some person on the currency. I'm writing about someone's grandfather, someone's father, whatever. Right. So, just kind of an aside there, thinking about John F. Kennedy getting assassinated, getting shot in the brain. So, back to the brain, that was considered evidence, and you can trace the path of the bullet. You were saying that you're a conspiracy theorist, so multiple bullets. And so maybe one came from the grassy knoll, right, not just from the 6th floor right. repository building. Maybe there were others. So that's number. And I'll say, when you read the reports of the first doctors who examined John F. Kennedy in Dallas, they do reference bullet in his throat.
Yes.
An entry wound in the throat, but when they tried to revive him, they did a tracheotomy and obliterated any reference. So there's questions later on, well, was that an entry wound or was that something else? So that's really interesting because some people can look at conspiracy theories or theorists as being really far out there. But then when you read a newspaper from November 23rd, 1963, and you see that, it's fascinating. So that's the number one most provocative reason why Robert Kennedy might have stolen his brother's brain, because maybe that brain had evidence that it wasn't just a single bullet coming from the 6th floor repository building.
That's absolutely
You're waiting
right.
for me to get there.
No, because you're absolutely right. Yeah, I could not agree with you more. Matter of fact, everything this is not TV, this is radio, but had you seen me, had we been in a TV studio, you'd have seen my head going up and down like a bobblehead, because everything that Lewis was saying, I've read and I've seen, I've researched, triangulated, absolutely everything that he said in terms of the body parts, the brain, the bullet, this and the other. And so I'm sitting there, he's talking, and I'm just sitting there going just like a bobblehead. But he's absolutely right. And so even that, again, behind the scenes, this is the problem, and that's why I say I'm an unapologetic conspiracy theorist, because for the most part, the masses will go with what they're told. So if the story is that it's a lone gunman, that's what okay, fine, it's a lone gunman, we went on about our business. But when you start getting into the research and start really kind of putting things together, it's like, okay, wait a minute now. That may not add up. That may not hold water based on all the other details and the facts that come about. All right. Now, it could have, I doubt it, that's just me, I doubt if it was a single gunman. In all of these cases, I don't think it was a single gunman. I don't think, first of all, the gunmen that were accused and charged, they weren't the brightest bulbs on the tree. So, I mean, it's like for them to pull that off, it's kind of like, So, but when you really start getting into the nits and nats and the details, then you kind of start getting a different story. So I was sitting here as Lewis was talking, like my head was like a bobblehead doll. Like, yes, he's absolutely right. Yes, that's exactly, yes. So anyway, I can only imagine. But at this point in the show, I'm going to turn the mic off for a couple of minutes and allow you to promote any book signings, anywhere they can get in touch with you, websites, the books themselves. Are they downloadable? Are they only in hard copy or softback? Or because if they're downloadable, I don't know if I did it already or not, because I know that day we met, I don't think I got anything that day at the fair, but I might have downloaded it. I'm not sure. If not, I will. But in any event, you have an opportunity to promote, and you can shout out anybody, anything you want. The only thing you cannot say is the price. Okay. That they can work out with you when you all talk. All right. But other than anything short of the price is yours.
Okay. Well, before any shameless self-promotion, let me thank you, Mark, for having me on the show.
Pleasure.
This was more than worth getting up early to be here for. I had a fantastic time. It's just a shame that we're out of time. Also, let me thank people that are out there listening, and thank Mrs. Robinson for calling in. It's a wonderful point that she brought up, and it really has me thinking, too, about service towards other people. How you can get in touch with me, my website, www.lewispicone.com, Louis, P as in president, ICONE.com. I'm on social media. I'm on LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, X, and Facebook. So you can reach out to me through any of those venues. As Mark mentioned, I've written 3 books, Where the Presidents Were Born, about all of the presidential birthplace. My second book, The President is Dead, The Extraordinary Stories of the Presidential Deaths, Final Days, Burials, and Beyond, about all the presidential deaths, every one of them. And then my third book, Grant's Tomb, The Epic Death of Ulysses S. Grant and the Making of an American Pantheon. We talked earlier about the death of Ulysses S. Grant. Much of the book, too, is about the making of his tomb, which is the largest tomb in North America to this day. Ulysses Grant had the largest funeral in American history up until that point in New York City. So if you're interested in any of those books, they're all available wherever books are sold. Amazon, Barnes & Noble, etc., local bookstores. They're all available in hardcover or paperback. The second 2, The President is Dead and Grant's Tomb, are also available in Kindle and audiobook as well, too. You can get actual CDs with the audio.
All right. Well, I'll tell you what, we did have one more question for you that came in on the computer, on the text system. It says, did Grant have any vices? How did he deal with the stress of the position?
Did he have any vices? Well, Grant was known, he had a drinking problem. And so earlier in his life, before the presidency, there's incidents where he drank. There are recorded incidents. There's really no evidence. His critics would really use that against him later on. And there's no evidence that his drinking impacted any battles or were at any crucial moments during the Civil War, but there are definitely well-recorded incidents of him drinking. And people said at the time, too, that he was very... you think of him as like this commanding general that would walk in and take up the entire door frame, but he wasn't. He was about 5'6", 5'7", a very slight individual. And everywhere he went, people were surprised when they saw him by his lack of physical presence. And so some would say, too, he just had no tolerance for drinking, that 1 or 2 glasses of wine would set him over the top. So that was probably his most prominent vice. Or maybe not a vice. It was a problem for him. It was a disease. And I think Ron Chernow does an excellent job at really framing his alcohol problem as a disease. But again, this didn't impact battles during the Civil War. It didn't impact his presidency. It became greatly exaggerated by his critics, which were many. So that's probably his most prominent vice. I think his weakness, which probably propelled him in that final battle, was his family. He loved his wife dearly. He loved his children dearly. Sometimes generals would come to his headquarters and they'd see him wrestling on the ground with his kids. So he was at his best when he was with his family. And going back to the alcoholism, when he was drinking, his family wasn't there, and he missed his family dearly. You can read his letters and just pining for his wife. And how are the children doing? Do they remember me? Do they remember their father? So it's kind of like sad to read those letters, and you can understand why he would resort to drinking sometimes.
Wow. Great question. Thanks so much.
Yeah,
Lewis, wow, blast. Loved it. Had an absolute blast talking historically, and again, I get a kick out of hearing and reading about and understanding the presidents, and so I am so glad we had an opportunity to have this chat, ladies and gentlemen. As you know, get the book. If you've been fascinated or you've been intrigued, or they whet your appetite, do go out and get the books. He's giving you the ways. So with that, we are pretty much done. I'm going to put some music back on, and then I'll let you out the door, and then I'll come back and finish up. And before you, it's already 8:20, so I got about another 40 minutes. Barry will be taking over the microphone, and we will be underway. So thank you so much again for joining me this morning. I'm glad you felt it was worth it.
Thank you.